Hello, everybody. We are live from Amsterdam, and today we have a very special guest. I am at Deloitte with.
With Jasper Verwaal, and I'm part of Deloitte's Web3 team.
That's awesome. So, we are going to talk today about what Deloitte is doing in the energy web ecosystem, why, their findings. So, let's start off, Jasper, with an introduction to Deloitte. Like, who is Deloitte? What are you guys doing? And how are you present in the Web3 domain?
Well, fantastic, Daniel. Of course, I'd love to tell about our presence in the Web3 domain. So maybe let's start off with our Dutch team and our service offerings. So in our team, we basically focus on four different service offerings. The first one being enterprise blockchain. And what we see in the market is that it is very important for the adoption of blockchain that enterprises also come on board into those blockchain ecosystems to really transform their processes. And through this pillar, we really help them to basically understand what it means to onboard into blockchain ecosystems and also build on top of those ecosystems. And yeah, the second service offering that we're really focusing on is the digital asset service offering. So what we see in the market is that there are many parties that are building on blockchain, crypto native companies, crypto exchanges, and we really help them from a wide variety of topics to really mature their business and do responsible business in this market, especially with the upcoming markets in crypto asset regulation. The European landscape is totally going to shift, and we really think that a lot of adoption will come post MiCA as well. So it's important to be in this domain. Then the third area is around unlimited reality. And what we see is that there were a lot of trends around the metaverse, but the metaverse is not here yet. And through the unlimited reality pillar, we really try to already help parties and enterprises envision what the metaverse is going to look like and really take them on the journey, for example, through AR and VR projects. And then, of course, the topic that's also very important for today is around decentralized ecosystems. And in the decentralized ecosystems pillar, we really look at all the blockchain ecosystems that are out there and select and research into what specific functions they have so that we can see what fits our client portfolio. And one of them, of course, is Energy Web. So we'd be happy to talk further around that.
Awesome. So, I think Deloitte's global BDA practice consists of around 500 active blockchain clients.
Yep. So indeed, we are then the Dutch team, but we are part of the broader Deloitte global blockchain and digital assets practice. And in there, we serve over 500 clients and have over 2,000 people that dedicate their daily work into this domain.
That's awesome. So let's talk a little bit more about Energy Web's involvement, or sorry, Deloitte's involvement in the Energy Web ecosystem. I believe you guys became a member late 2022. So how was that? How did you guys become a member? Why did you guys become a member? And what's so important for you guys in terms of adoption and Web3 technologies?
Well, very happy to tell something about that. So what we see is that the energy transition is one of the key domains that basically the world is currently having to deal with. And we believe that blockchain can really accelerate the energy transition if used well. But to do that, you need to have the right ecosystem to build on top of, and you have to have enterprises that basically understand how to incorporate this into their business processes, because it's completely different from their usual way of working, and they really have to make this shift to embrace this new technology. And why we selected Energy Web really has to do with three things. So the first one is really around the architecture that Energy Web has already built. So for example, around asset management, exchanging data, and also around green proofs. And what's very important, blockchain can be seen as public infrastructure. So the more standardization that's in place, the easier it is to adopt common methodologies, because blockchain is never done alone. You always have to do it with other parties, because otherwise it does not make sense. So the more architecture that you have in place, the better the outcome can be. Then what's also very important for ecosystems is, of course, the members that are already present in there. So what we've taken a look at is like who is already active in the Energy Web domain, and many significant players, at least in the European landscape, are already part of Energy Web and are actively building on top of it. So the more members in the ecosystem, the more relevant the solution becomes. And then one super key thing in the enterprise world is really around the consensus mechanism. So what you would, of course, like to have is a public blockchain, but it's not always possible to really use that for all processes. So at least one of the things that Energy Web has done differently than other blockchains is really create a different consensus mechanism that enables Energy Web to at least verify who is running validator nodes. And that means that you always know who's processing the blocks. And from a legal perspective, that really helps to enable enterprises to use this ecosystem.
Yeah. So Jasper, one of the questions I get very often is, how easy is it for a big company like Deloitte to get involved in, let's say, an Energy Web ecosystem? Is it something that happens overnight, or is that something that happens in months because you need to talk to all the departments? How does that work in general?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question, and I will also tell something about that later in this presentation. Because, of course, doing this from an enterprise perspective, you really have to know what you're starting at, especially at a company as large as Deloitte, and also with an audit portfolio. You can't do everything in a Deloitte context. So there went plenty of research into this area, and one of the outcomes of that is the digital asset framework that I will tell something about later in this presentation.
That's awesome. So let's jump into some lessons that you guys have learned over the past 2 years. Like, you guys joined late 2022, as we just said. Are there any lessons you guys have learned so far?
Yep. Well, of course, there's lessons to be learned when dealing with blockchain ecosystems, because unfortunately it is not common yet. But I'm happy to share something about the lessons that we've learned. So basically, what I've done for today is that we've identified 4 specific lessons that I would like to take you through today. The first lesson is really around the blockchain triangle. So how can you use the blockchain triangle for ideation, basically, and when do use cases make sense? The second one is around ecosystem considerations. So when you're going to select an ecosystem, what do you have to take into account? Third one has to do with the digital asset framework. So how can you actually prepare your enterprise from a business and process perspective to deal with blockchain ecosystems in an operational way? And then the fourth one is really around on-chain and off-chain considerations. So one of the common challenges for enterprises is, where do I leave my data? Does it live on-chain, or does it live in my own solution? So we'll also be talking you to the framework. So maybe let's start with the first one, being the blockchain triangle. So what we see in the blockchain world is that a blockchain basically enables you to have an immutable audit trail of all your data. So you can store important pieces of information on the blockchain, so that you can always have this immutable ledger that you can always track and see basically what the audit trail of the information was. And ultimately, where that will lead us is that in the current world, a lot of data is really siloed in organizations. But through blockchain, we can basically build a shared environment that multiple parties use around the same data points, so that you have a lot less challenges around your data, and that you can basically build your processes on top of each other's process. And when you think about this immutable audit trail, one specific thing that you can consider has to do with this blockchain triangle. Because in the digital world, previously, prior to blockchain, it was not possible to ensure that you have that you own something in the digital domain.
Yeah.
And now with blockchain, because you have this immutable audit trail, the blockchain triangle comes to life. And it consists of 3 specific elements. So the first one is identity. So you can give an identity to specific items in the digital and in the physical space, and have a representation of it on the blockchain. Then the second component has to do with ownership. So you can see who has ownership of a specific thing at a specific point in time. And then the third component of that blockchain triangle has to do with payments, because previously it was not possible to do payments without an intermediary, but now through blockchain that is possible. So you can basically create use cases around those 3 components of the blockchain triangle. And maybe to translate that into a practical example, you can, for example, think about charging your electric car. So you can give the charging pole and your car an identity, so that they know who they are. You can ensure that you have ownership of the car and the charging card, etc., and that you maintain that on chain. And then you can also bring payments into the mix and practically, for example, plug in your cord in the charger, and the car takes care of itself and can also do the payment required for the
Yeah.
transaction.
So why is this so important? Why is this the first lesson learned? Like, why is it important? I get that, hey, you have a car, perfect example, by the way. You have a car, the car has an identity. So you also know who the owner of the car is. So we match this together. And then obviously for a charging session, there needs to be a payment. But why is this so important? How did this came up as one of the first lessons?
Yeah, so in the blockchain ecosystem, it is really around, so when does it make sense to use blockchain?
Yeah.
And it does not make sense to use blockchain for everything. And ultimately, in many cases, blockchain can make processes better. And yeah, you really have to think about in what cases does that involve. So in cases where you have many participants, in cases where you want to make sure that you have only one version of data, where you want to transfer ownership, for example, e-bill of ladings, where you have to make sure that one bill of lading exists at a single point, and where you want to make sure that you have the exact owner at the point in time. And yeah, in situations with a lot of complexity and many parties in the value chain, this makes sense. And basically, the triangle helps you to think about cases. Okay, so is there a case where I want to have the identity of something? Is there a case where I want to track the ownership of something? And do I also want to add payments into the mix? And those, yeah, you can basically mix and match those types of use cases on the blockchain.
Perfect example. So let's go to the second lesson learned. I believe the second lesson learned is all about ecosystem considerations. Can you talk us through the second lesson?
Yep, no, you're right indeed. So in the ecosystem, well, basically our lessons learned around the ecosystem is that in the more traditional non-blockchain context, you see that a lot of parties are thinking about their ecosystem, around their solution. So I'm building an application, I want to have as many participants into my application, and then from there I can grow, because the more users, the more services I can offer, etc., etc. But when you're thinking about a blockchain ecosystem context, there's a new dimension that comes into play. And that really has to do with the blockchain ecosystem in itself. And as I mentioned before, in the energy web ecosystem, you see that there are already building blocks present. You see that there are already members in the ecosystem. So if you really think about, okay, so what blockchain ecosystem fits my use case and my basically application where you want to build an ecosystem around, this can really help you to even accelerate your own application. For example, through in cases of the four areas. So first one being around, well, you want to have through blockchain ecosystems, basically you can create this single source of truth that's often talked about.
Yeah.
Second area is really around accelerating your technical delivery, because the blockchain ecosystem already contains those standardized modules that you can use and for your own application and its benefits. Then the third one is really around the acceleration of the enterprise adoption, because if many enterprises are already using those components that are already present in, for example, the energy web ecosystem, that can really help to speed things up on an adoption perspective, because as mentioned before, you never do blockchain on your own. You always have to work with other parties. And then in some cases, it might even make financially sense to think about specific blockchain ecosystems, because there are many grant incentives in ecosystems that can help you to speed up building on a specific ecosystem.
Yeah. So on the grant perspective note, I think we spoke about it in one of the previous sessions that Energy Web is also creating a grant program. Would this be interesting to enterprises to kind of like get more involved there? If they can earn a grant or open a grant or even help other companies. Obviously, our ecosystem consists of multiple enterprises. Would Deloitte be willing to say, hey, whatever enterprise, you can come to us and we can help you with XYZ? Does that work?
Yep. For example, so at Deloitte, we really also want to practice what we preach. So we really try to do what we advise our clients as well. So, for example, we are also part of a grant program at the moment, and we really build on top of this. And we have also prepared Deloitte in itself for example, receiving energy web tokens, so that we can also deal with them in an operational and enterprise context.
Yeah. So Deloitte is building. That's the quote for today.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's very important to, of course, know what you're talking about.
Awesome. So let's go to lesson 3.
Yep.
I believe lesson 3, as we can see on the slides, obviously, is all about the digital asset framework. I know out of our conversation that this is very important for you guys. Can you tell us why it's important and what the digital asset framework for Deloitte looks like?
Yep. So as mentioned before, enterprises cannot just adopt blockchain and blockchain ecosystems. It's actually, from a practical perspective, still quite complicated, unfortunately. And we all know that this is a journey and it takes time. But really thinking through the digital asset framework really helps you to balance basically your innovation. So what do I want to do? How can I make my business better using blockchain ecosystems like Energy Web? But how can I also mitigate the risks involved when dealing with blockchain ecosystems? And this is why we created the digital asset framework for us as Deloitte and for our clients to really think about, okay, what do I have to think about when I'm onboarding a blockchain ecosystem or when I'm building on top of a blockchain ecosystem? So basically what you can see on the slides is that we have identified 5 categories where you really have to think about. So the first category has to do with the regulatory aspects. So as I mentioned before, the markets in crypto asset regulation is coming around, and in that area, basically it specifies 10 specific services that classify you as a crypto asset service provider. So when you're building on top of a blockchain ecosystem, it might very well be that you, if you have not researched the regulatory aspects, that you're building something that's classified under MiCA, and thereby subjecting yourself to having to get a license, which is, of course, unfortunate if you have already built it and don't know that yet.
So, Jasper, one question there. So, obviously, regulations are changing. Are you guys monitoring this?
Yep, absolutely. So we have to stay ahead of this area to make sure that we know what's going on and also know about the specific operational challenges, because, of course, regulations are guiding, but you also have to know how to deal with it, deal with them, basically, from an operational perspective.
Perfect.
Then on the second area, it really has to do with the financial aspect. So as mentioned before, Energy Web has its own token, the Energy Web token, and that's classified as a cryptocurrency. But from an accounting perspective, you really have to think about, okay, how am I going to record this into my own, for example, SAP environment? What is the accounting classification? What about the valuation? And also the practical aspects, like if you have tokens, it might very well be that your ERP system does not recognize that category. And you cannot just access your tokens through a banking environment. So how are you going to process your payments in an operational way and manage all those aspects? So you really have to think about the financial considerations as well.
Yeah. And this one, so Energy Web has a token, Energy Web token, as you just said. The token is also a utility, right? You're using it for applications, Energy Web X. Does that also come into the same category? Like, can you easily use the token to enable applications within our ecosystem? Or is a company like Deloitte in this framework also then considering, hey, can we see this as a token that enables stuff? Does it work like this? Is it then a payment token? How does that work?
Yeah, so that comes back indeed to the regulatory aspect. So what's very important is that you can have the practical consequences of what you're doing with it, but you also have to see how it is classified from a legal and an accounting perspective to really know what you're dealing with. And those can be 2 different worlds, basically. So even though you might be just using it as a utility, it might be classified something else. So it's very important that you have basically your policies in place on how you view it, so that you can always explain how you mitigated the risks, for example.
Awesome. Looks like you guys are 2 steps ahead of the curve here.
Then the third area is really around governance. So how are you going to build on top of those ecosystems? Who is involved in the governance of the ecosystem? So is it a real public ecosystem, and is the governance more intransparent, or is it? Yeah. So do you know who involves that? Because if you're choosing to build on top of a specific ecosystem, you want to have at least insight in who is making the changes to the protocol, for example. And in the case of Energy Web, as a validator, you can be, for example, involved in the governance of the Energy Web ecosystem. So there are many reasons to, when you're considering your ecosystem, well, what's important for you and what choice do you make? So is governance important for you, or do you want to, for example, use public infrastructure or public blockchains?
And how important is it for Deloitte to know the ecosystem participants? So we have a bunch of companies in the ecosystem, and obviously everybody knows them. We verified them. How important is this for Deloitte? Can you join an ecosystem where, let's say, the validators are unknown?
Well, I think we have to make a distinction between two things. So what we like is that Energy Web is public permissioned, so everyone can build on top of Energy Web, everyone can use Energy Web, but that really the consensus mechanism is a permissioned environment. And in the case of Energy Web, and for us as Deloitte, it's very important that we know that the validators are basically known and verified, that we know who the counterparty is when we're, well, for example, dealing with transactions in the network, like who is doing what, who is getting the fee to basically validate the next block, because you have to know that, for example, from a sanctions perspective as well.
Yeah, you don't want to verify transactions from someone that's not known or someone that does things that they are not supposed to do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, both as a validator, of course, you want to know, but also as a just regular user, you want to know that.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah.
All right. Well, that brings us to the technical aspects. So you really have to think. One of the key things, of course, in the blockchain world, has to do with well, the technical aspects. So, for example, around custody, how are you going to deal with the custody of your, in this case, Energy Web tokens? Are you going to do this yourself? Are you going to have your own custodial wallets, or are you going to outsource it to a third party? And then, if you're going to outsource it, how are you going to take care of third-party risk management? So how do you know that you can trust your counterparty when you, for example, share the tokens with them so that they hold them in custody for you? And yeah, there's basically many aspects around what you have to.
How's Deloitte basically? How's Deloitte doing this with the tokens? Do you have your own custody? Is it, because obviously we get those questions, right? Hey, is Deloitte having their own wallets now? Is it on an exchange? How does that work? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yep. So as you mentioned before, it has taken us a while to get all the approvals, of course, in place to participate in the Energy Web ecosystem. And one of those areas is really around custody. So what we have done is that we have created our own custody solution to basically hold our own Energy Web tokens within Deloitte. So we made the deliberate choice not to outsource the custody services, but create it ourselves.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And then that brings us to the last area of the digital assets framework, which is really around the reputational aspects. So blockchain, well, unfortunately, it is not always recognized well by all parties in the market. So you really have to think about, okay, so what parties am I going to work together with when I'm building this solution? What ecosystem am I going to build on? Is it reliable? And also, what happens, for example, if a blockchain network goes down? How are you going to deal with that? If your services stop, what influence do you have? Because often you cannot just call
help desk
the help desk of the blockchain ecosystem. So you really have to think about all those things in advance when you're participating in those decentralized ecosystems.
Perfect. That makes total sense. So I believe the next topic that we will talk about is all about. Jasper, help, volgende slide.
Yep. It's about basically the fourth lesson that we want to take you through, and this has to do with, it's more of a technical concept, but of course when you're thinking about blockchain, you're always thinking about the blockchain in itself, and then you have all the applications basically on top of that. So not necessarily running on the blockchain, but things like ERP systems, etc.
Yeah.
And this lesson is really around fundamental design choices that you have to make when you are building on top of a blockchain ecosystem. And basically what we've done is that we've identified 3 specific ways to basically build your solution and use the blockchain in itself for the functions that it has. So the first function basically has to do with hashing. So what you see is that we've talked about the immutable audit trail, and one of the approaches that you can take is that you run all your processes just in your own environment or with other parties, but off-chain. But that you only, at some points, you say, I want to have a timestamp of this information in place so that, for example, I can always recall that this contract that we both signed existed at this point in time because the hash is available on the blockchain. But the challenge there is that, for example, if you lose the contract, the hash remains, but you can never prove that contract related to the hash if you lose the original document. So that's one of the considerations that you have to take when you're only hashing. So yes, it provides timestamp information, but you're not using many of the functionalities of a blockchain in itself.
Yeah. So hashing is basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, hashing is basically you provide a timestamp on the blockchain that something happened, but you still have the contract yourself. So if you lose the contract, you just have a timestamp.
Correct. But
Awesome. Okay.
you can't go back from the timestamp to the contract. So that's the challenge. And it can be a deliberate choice, but those choices are basically fundamental design choices, and you can't easily change it later in your process because it requires quite a bit of redesign.
Okay.
And that brings us to the second option that you can take, and that's the hash-based token. And in that case, you already go into the next level, so to say, of using a blockchain. And that is really also for transferring ownership, as we talked about earlier. But in this case, you're still not adding a lot of data to the blockchain. So you only use the hash, and that creates a token. And you can shift this token from company A to company B, for example, to transfer the ownership of the token. But there's not a lot of data in the token because you only have the hash as a reference. So you still can't use many of the, basically on-chain functionalities that we talked about earlier. And then that brings us into the third category, and that has to do with data-based tokens. And in this case, you basically flip the idea, and I'll have a visual on this later. But what you see is that in this case, you also shift data to live on the for example, Energy Web chain. And in this case, what you will have is that you can have plain text, you can have cryptographic content, and you can also use privacy-enhancing technologies. So those things relate basically to technologies like zero-knowledge proofs that enable you to, for example, share data using a blockchain, but encrypted in such a way that, for example, you only share the output. So, for example, if you have to provide your own identity card. For example, if you're above 18, then you won't have to show your identity card, but the signal will say yes or no, depending on your age. So that's a way to prevent the exact data from being shown. And this really enables you to use all the blockchain functionalities like ownership transfer, like identity, like using payments to also incorporate them into your business process. But this third methodology is, from an enterprise context, you really have to think this through. So what information am I going to post? Is this okay today? And is this okay tomorrow, for example? And how do you set
I
up
get it.
processes?
And this is because enterprises basically want to use blockchain and all the benefits that come with it, but also need to be very careful with what they share on the public blockchain, right? So if they can share something, whatever, a contract, just as an example, where they don't need to put the whole contract on the blockchain, but in a way they can say, hey, yes, two parties signed, or the data can get matched with whatever software like Energy Web X. That's the outcome. That's what you guys are looking for, right?
Correct. So this is indeed the third case example. And because we discussed the fact that the blockchain is an immutable audit trail, if it's ever on the blockchain, it never goes away. So you have to really consider this beforehand. And also, for example, when you're building the smart contracts, you really have to do them well because you have to have them first time right, so to say.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, that's for the fourth lesson basically, and the categories. And maybe Daniel, let me show you also what this looks like from a visual perspective, because of course this is quite a technical concept. But what we see is that in the first case, this is the hashing only scenario. the majority of all the information only sits in the enterprise's domain, and barely any information lives on the blockchain, as we see below. So only the hash is shared with the blockchain ecosystem. In the second scenario, we basically flip this around. So we start with the blockchain being the basis. So we are thinking about, okay, the blockchain is going to serve as the way, for example, to transfer ownership. And then next to that, we have the company systems that have specific information around processes that we do not need to share on chain to have our process basically operational. And then in the last case, and this is where we really take full use of the blockchain functionalities. So we can, for example, deal with ownership, but we also have data in place that can be used, for example, to have specific rules in place. So if scenario X happens, then outcome Y should be realized, because the logic can basically be built on chain. But to build it on chain, you have to have specific pieces of data in place.
Yeah.
And of course, what we hope is that, and this is the challenging thing from an enterprise context, at this point, many enterprises find it challenging to put data on chain. But we hope that Energy Web X will contribute to making it easier to decide what data lives on chain and what data lives on chain.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So what we do with Energy Web X is making sure that the data that's on chain, or if you say, hey, I have one here and one there, that the data gets matched without putting a lot of data from the enterprises on chain. So yeah, I really get why you guys hope that this works. I'm pretty sure it will work. Obviously, we gave you guys a big presentation last week. But really, really cool to see all those lessons, and really cool to see how detailed you guys basically went into the Energy Web ecosystem or blockchain in general, because these are just 4 lessons, right? But in general, I can imagine that you guys have had like hundreds of conversations out of this.
Absolutely. There are many aspects, and just, for example, the digital asset framework, the topics that we talked about, those are the tip of the iceberg, but there are so many things to take care of. And of course, you have to find the right balance between innovation and staying in control.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
And maybe on that topic, that also brings us into the next area. So what do we want to do at Deloitte, and how do we want to bring the ecosystem forward? So the first thing really is around the digital assets framework. We would love to help other parties to onboard into blockchain ecosystems and help them basically structure their own organization and help them to increase the maturity to be able to actually operationally use blockchain ecosystems, because making a POC or a minimum viable product, that's usually easy, but really getting it into place and also with other ecosystem parties, that is the most challenging thing.
Yeah, and that's where the magic of Deloitte lies, right? So what you're saying here is, hey, if you want to do a POC, fine. If you have a minimum viable product, fine. But Deloitte wants to drag those enterprises to make a real product out of their POCs, MVPs. We are here. We are ready to build. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So indeed, we want to help enterprises to do this in the right way so that they can do responsible business on the blockchain and help their business become even better than they are today. And then the second thing, of course, is that we would love to help enterprises to build on top of the Energy Web or the Energy Web X ecosystem. So
perfect.
Yeah, we look forward to that.
Yeah, very exciting. So yeah, I see that on the other slide you have connecting Web 2 to Web 3. How is Deloitte playing a part there? Can you give an example there?
Yep. So many of our clients, of course, they are still in the Web 2 domain, but Web 3 is quite a big paradigm shift on how you're going to share information and who has control of information. So in the Web 3 domain, many things live on decentralized infrastructure. And for example, as we talked about the blockchain triangle with the 3 elements, how are you going to structure that? And if you're used to having control of a specific thing at this point, and you're basically giving this control away because you're going to use this public infrastructure or component, that's going to be quite a shift in how you do your business and also how you engage people, for example, around your brand.
Awesome. Awesome to hear that Deloitte is excited. We are excited. Our members are excited. So I believe we should do this over again in a couple months.
Yep. No, thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to speak about our presence in the Energy Web ecosystem and the broader Web3 domain. And I look forward to many more conversations, and also for everyone listening in today, happy to have a conversation on how we can help your enterprise forward.
Yeah, so thanks everyone. If you need any help, if you need anything from Deloitte, you can send an email to hello@energyweb.org, and we will connect you guys from there.
Great.
Thanks, Jasper. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure.
Awesome.